You know, when folks ask me about the war, they always want to hear about the battles, the heroics, the glory. But let me tell you something. There wasn't much glory in Europe back in '44. What I remember most? The sleeping. Or rather, the trying to sleep. In Europe, we slept packed together because there was nowhere else to go. 15, 20 men crammed into spaces meant for 5. We'd huddle up against each other like sardines in a tin can. And you know what? Nobody complained. Not once. Because that closeness, that human warmth pressing against you from every side, that's what kept us alive. Not just our bodies, but our souls too. My name is James Callahan. Most folks called me Jack. I was born in 1923 in a little town called Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Coal country, hard country. The kind of place where men went underground before sunrise and came back up after dark, if they came back up at all. My father was one of those men until the black lung took him when I was 16. After that, it was just me, my mother, and my kid sister Clara trying to make ends meet. Now, before I go any further, if you're finding value in these old memories of mine, I'd be mighty grateful if you'd hit that like button down below, and if you want to hear more stories from my time in the war, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. It means more than you know to this old soldier. I enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor, December 10th, 1941. I remember standing in that recruitment line in Philadelphia, surrounded by hundreds of other young men, all of us burning with the same righteous anger. We were going to show those Japanese what Americans were made of. We were going to end this war by Christmas. God, we were naive. Basic training at Fort Benning was nothing compared to what waited for us across the Atlantic. They taught us to shoot, to march, to follow orders. What they didn't teach us, what they couldn't teach us, was how to watch your best friend bleed out in the mud while enemy fire kept you pinned down and helpless. They didn't teach us how to keep going when every fiber of your being screamed at you to stop. They didn't teach us about the cold. Lord Almighty, they didn't teach us about the cold. I shipped out with the 29th Infantry Division in October of 1943. The crossing took 12 days on a transport ship called the USS Wakefield. Now you want to talk about sleeping packed together? That ship was our first real lesson. We were stacked 4 bunks high in compartments below deck that smelled of diesel fuel, sweat, and fear. The Atlantic in October is no friend to landlubbers. And about half the men spent the voyage hanging over the rails or filling their helmets. I was lucky, my stomach held. But sleep was near impossible, with the constant rolling of the ship and the sounds of men retching all around you. There was a kid from Brooklyn bunked above me. Name was Anthony Russo, but everyone called him Tony. 19 years old, same as me at the time. He had this thick accent that made everything he said sound like a joke, even when he was dead serious. First night out, he leans over the edge of his bunk and says to me, "Hey, Pennsylvania, you think they got Italian food where we're going?" I told him I doubted the Germans were going to serve us spaghetti. He laughed so hard he nearly fell out of his bunk. Tony became my closest friend in the war. Some friendships are forged in good times, barbecues and baseball games and lazy summer afternoons. Ours was forged in something else entirely, in fear, in exhaustion, in the shared understanding that any moment could be our last. We landed in England first, trained for months in the countryside, preparing for what they called Operation Overlord. We didn't know the details then, nobody did except the brass, but we knew it was going to be big, the biggest amphibious invasion in history, they told us later. At the time, all we knew was that we were going to France, and a lot of us weren't coming back. Those months in England, we were billeted in everything you can imagine. Old manor houses with the furniture covered in sheets, barns that still smelled of hay and manure, churches where we'd sleep in the pews and wake up with hymnal pages stuck to our faces, tent cities in muddy fields where the rain never seemed to stop, and always, we slept packed together. Not because we had to, but because we wanted to. Because in the dark, when the fear crept in, and you started thinking about what was coming, the sound of another man's breathing reminded you that you weren't alone. There was one night, I must have been sometime in April of '44, when we were quartered in this old stone barn outside a village called Ivybridge. Rain was coming down so hard it sounded like machine gun fire on the roof. About 30 of us were packed into that barn, lying on straw that had seen better days, trying to get some sleep before another day of training exercises. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept wandering to things I didn't want to think about. My mother's face when I left, Clara waving from the porch, trying not to cry, the letters I'd been writing home, full of lies about how safe everything was and how the food wasn't half bad. I was lying there in the dark, eyes wide open, when I heard someone crying. Now you have to understand, crying wasn't something men did back then, not openly. We were raised to believe that tears were weakness, and weakness got you killed. But in the dark, in that barn, with the rain drowning out everything else, someone was sobbing like their heart was breaking. I didn't move at first. Didn't want to embarrass whoever it was. But the crying went on, and after a while I couldn't just lie there anymore. I got up quiet-like and made my way through the sleeping bodies until I found him. It was a kid named William Cooper. Billy, we called him. He was 18, fresh out of high school in Iowa. Farm boy with freckles and red hair and hands that were too big for his wrists. He was curled up against the barn wall, knees to his chest, shoulders shaking. I didn't say anything. Just sat down next to him, close enough that our shoulders touched. After a while the crying slowed down. He wiped his face with his sleeve and whispered, "I'm sorry, Jack. I'm sorry." I told him there was nothing to be sorry for. I told him we were all scared. I told him that fear didn't make him weak, it made him human. I don't know if any of it helped, but we sat there together until the rain stopped. And when morning came, neither of us mentioned it. But from then on, Billy Cooper slept next to me whenever he could. I think that human contact, that simple presence, helped him keep it together. June 6th, 1944. D-Day. I know you've heard the stories, seen the movies, read the books. But let me tell you something, none of it captures what it was really like. The sound alone was indescribable. The constant roar of naval guns, the screaming of artillery shells, the rattle of machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and underneath it all, the cries of dying men. We were supposed to land on a stretch of beach, codenamed Omaha. My unit was in the second wave, which meant we got to watch the first wave get torn to pieces while we waited in our landing craft. The water around us turned red. Bodies floated past, face down. Some of them were missing parts. I saw a man's helmet drift by with his head still in it. Tony was next to me in the landing craft. His face was white as chalk, but his jaw was set. He looked at me and said, "See you on the beach, Pennsylvania." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. When the ramp dropped, we ran into hell. The water was chest-deep in places, and the weight of our gear kept pulling us under. Men around me were falling, some from bullets, some from drowning. I don't know how I made it to the beach. I don't remember deciding to keep moving. My body just did what it had been trained to do while my mind went somewhere else entirely. I found Tony an hour later, or what was left of him. He'd made it maybe 20 yards past the waterline before a mortar round found him. I couldn't stay with him. Couldn't even close his eyes. I had to keep moving forward because stopping meant dying, and I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. We took that beach. You know that. The history books tell you that. What they don't tell you is what it cost. What it took from the men who survived. I walked past boys I'd shared meals with, shared jokes with, shared fears with, and they were just gone. Broken and empty on the sand, their blood mixing with the salt water, their eyes staring at a sky they'd never see again. That night, our first night in France, we slept in a crater made by naval bombardment. 12 of us left from a unit of 30. We lay there in the dirt, pressed against each other, not talking, barely breathing. I remember the smell of cordite and copper, and something else I'd later learn was the smell of death. I remember looking up at the stars, the same stars I used to watch from my porch back in Millbrook, and thinking how strange it was that they could look the same when everything else had changed. The man next to me was named George Patterson. Sergeant Patterson, technically, though rank didn't mean much in that crater. He was older than most of us, 32, which seemed ancient at the time, and he had a wife and 2 kids back in Ohio. He hadn't said a word since we'd made it off the beach, but sometime in the night, he reached over and grabbed my hand. Didn't say anything, just held on. I held on too. We stayed like that until dawn. The push inland was a blur of hedgerows and ambushes and villages with names I couldn't pronounce. The Bocage country of Normandy was nothing like what we'd trained for. The hedgerows were centuries old, thick and tall, with root systems so dense you couldn't blast through them. Every field was a potential death trap. Every tree line could be hiding a German machine gun nest. We learned to fight in ways they never taught us in basic training. We learned to listen for the subtle sounds that meant danger, the click of a rifle being cocked, the rustle of movement in the underbrush, the silence that meant an ambush was waiting. And every night, wherever we were, we slept packed together. In ditches, in ruined farmhouses, in foxholes filled with water. Sometimes we'd find a barn that was still standing, and it felt like a luxury hotel. We'd pile in, arrange ourselves like puzzle pieces, and try to steal a few hours of rest before the next day's march. There was something sacred about those nights. I know that sounds strange, using a word like sacred to describe a bunch of filthy, exhausted soldiers crammed together in the dark, but it was. In those moments, rank disappeared. Fear disappeared. It was just men, human beings, sharing warmth and space, and the simple miracle of still being alive. I remember one night in late June. We'd taken a village called St. Lo, or at least part of it. The fighting had been brutal, house to house, room to room, sometimes hand to hand. Half the village was rubble, the other half was burning. We found a cellar under what used to be a bakery, and about 20 of us squeezed in there to sleep. The cellar still smelled like bread. Isn't that strange? Amid all the death and destruction, all the smoke and blood, that cellar smelled like fresh-baked bread. It was the most comforting thing I'd experienced in weeks. We lay there in the dark, bodies touching, and for a few hours we could almost pretend we were somewhere else. Somewhere safe. Billy Cooper was still with us then. He'd made it through D-Day, though something in his eyes had changed. That innocent farm boy from Iowa was gone, replaced by something harder, older. But that night in the bakery cellar, I heard him whisper, "My mom used to make bread every Sunday. I can almost smell it." I told him I could smell it too. We talked for a while about home, about the things we missed, about the things we were fighting for. It was the first real conversation we'd had since the invasion. Billy told me about his family's farm, about the fields of corn that stretched to the horizon, about his dog named Chester who used to sleep at the foot of his bed. I told him about Millbrook, about the mountains and the mines, about my father and how he used to tell me stories about the old country, even though he'd been born in Pennsylvania just like me. We fell asleep mid-conversation, the way you do when you're exhausted beyond reason. When I woke up, Billy was pressed against my back, still asleep, his breath warm on my neck. For just a moment, I let myself feel grateful. Grateful that we were both still alive. Grateful for the warmth, grateful for the smell of bread that was probably just a memory but felt so real. The war kept moving and we moved with it. Across France, into Belgium. By fall, we were in Germany itself and the fighting was getting fiercer. The Germans knew they were losing, but that just made them more dangerous. They fought for every inch of ground, every village, every bridge. The casualties mounted, and the faces around me kept changing as replacements came in to fill the gaps left by the dead and wounded. Sleep became more precious than gold. We'd catch it wherever we could, in abandoned houses, in churches, in factories, in the backs of trucks rolling toward the front. The cold was our constant enemy. Fall turned to winter, and the winter of '44 was one of the coldest Europe had seen in decades. We didn't have proper winter gear at first. We wrapped ourselves in whatever we could find, blankets, curtains, even newspapers stuffed inside our jackets. I remember one night in November. We were somewhere near the German border, dug into a hillside that overlooked a valley. The ground was frozen solid, and our foxholes were more like shallow graves in the ice. The temperature dropped so low that the metal of our rifles burned our hands when we touched it. I was sharing a foxhole with George Patterson, Sergeant Patterson, and a new kid whose name I never learned. He'd been with us less than a week. We huddled together like animals, our bodies shaking uncontrollably, our teeth chattering so loud I was sure the Germans could hear us across the valley. George had lost feeling in his feet hours ago. The new kid was crying, though the tears froze on his cheeks before they could fall. I held them both as tight as I could, trying to share whatever warmth my body still had, knowing it wasn't enough. "Tell me something good, Jack," George whispered through blue lips. "Tell me about home." So I did. I told him about summer in Millbrook, about swimming in the creek that ran behind the Thompson farm, about the 4th of July parade down Main Street and the fireworks over the hills, about my mother's apple pie and how she'd always save me the biggest slice. I talked until my voice gave out, and then I just held on, hoping the sunrise would come before the cold took us. We made it through that night, all three of us. The new kid lost 2 toes to frostbite, and George's feet never fully recovered, but we survived. A lot of men didn't. The cold killed as surely as the Germans did, maybe more surely. You can hide from bullets, duck behind cover, dig a foxhole. You can't hide from the cold. It finds you, it seeps into your bones. It makes you sleepy, which is the most dangerous thing of all, because if you fall asleep in that kind of cold, you don't wake up. December brought something worse than cold. Something that would haunt every survivor for the rest of their lives, the Battle of the Bulge. We were in Belgium when it started. December 16th, 1944. The Germans launched a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest, catching us completely by surprise. They had tanks, they had men, they had a ferocity born of desperation, and they pushed us back. For the first time since D-Day, we were retreating. The confusion was absolute. Units got separated. Communications broke down. We didn't know where the enemy was or how many of them there were. Rumors spread faster than orders. The Germans had broken through. The Germans were everywhere. The Germans were disguising themselves as Americans and infiltrating our lines. That last one turned out to be true, which made everything worse. We couldn't trust anyone we didn't know personally. I got separated from my unit during a nighttime retreat. A German artillery barrage caught us on an open road, and in the chaos that followed, I found myself alone in a frozen forest with no idea where I was or where I was supposed to go. The snow was coming down so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The cold was beyond anything I'd experienced before, and somewhere out there, German soldiers were hunting for survivors. I walked for hours, or maybe days. Time lost meaning in that white hell. I was hypothermic, delirious, moving on instinct alone. I talked to myself to stay awake. I talked to Tony, even though Tony was dead. I talked to my father, even though he'd been gone for years. I told them I was sorry. Sorry I couldn't save them. Sorry I couldn't be stronger. Sorry I was probably going to die alone in a forest, in a country I'd never heard of before the war. I found them by accident. Or maybe they found me. A group of American soldiers huddled in a hunting cabin that had been abandoned, or whose owners had fled when the fighting started. There were 8 of them, from 4 different units, all as lost and scared as I was. They'd built a small fire, though they knew the smoke was a risk because they were choosing between freezing to death and being found by the Germans. They let me in, made room for me by the fire, shared what little food they had. I don't remember their names. The cold had done something to my memory, but I remember their faces. The way the firelight flickered across features that were too young for this, too tired, too haunted. We were all someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend, and we were all terrified. We slept in that cabin for 3 nights while the battle raged around us, slept in a pile like puppies, bodies intertwined, sharing every bit of warmth we could. During the day, we took turns standing watch, but at night we couldn't spare anyone to the cold. We all had to sleep together, or we'd all die alone. On the 3rd night, German soldiers found the cabin. I woke to shouting and gunfire. One of our guys, a corporal from the 82nd Airborne, had been on watch and saw them coming. He raised the alarm and took down 2 of them before a bullet caught him in the throat. The rest of us scrambled for our weapons, but we were outnumbered and outgunned. The firefight lasted maybe 30 seconds. When it was over, 4 of our guys were dead, and the rest of us had our hands up. They herded us outside into the snow. I was sure they were going to shoot us. The Germans in the Bulge weren't taking many prisoners, especially in those early days when they thought they were winning. I looked at the men beside me, strangers who had become brothers in a matter of days, and wondered which of us would be first. But the German officer in charge, a young man who looked almost as exhausted as we did, just stared at us for a long moment. Then he said something in German that I didn't understand, and his men started marching us east, prisoners of war. That's what we were now. The march was brutal, miles through frozen forest with no food and barely any water. Men who couldn't keep up were shot and left where they fell. We walked until our feet bled, until our hands were too frozen to feel, until everything became a blur of white and grey and pain. But we kept walking because the alternative was a bullet in the back of the head. They put us on a train eventually, cattle cars, packed so tight that we couldn't sit down. The journey took days. I don't know how many because time had lost all meaning. Men died standing up, their bodies held upright by the press of other bodies. The smell was indescribable, sweat and waste and death all mixed together in a miasma of human suffering. And yet, even there, we found ways to help each other. We took turns standing near the tiny cracks in the walls where fresh air seeped in. We shared body heat with those who were weakest. We talked to keep each other awake, to keep each other sane. A man from Chicago told jokes that weren't funny, but we laughed anyway because laughing meant we were still alive. A man from Texas sang hymns in a voice that was cracked and broken but somehow beautiful. A man from somewhere, I never learned where, held my hand through the worst of it and didn't let go. The camp was called Stalag Neu B. It was near a town called Bad Orb in central Germany. When we arrived, I weighed maybe 120 pounds. I'd weighed 170 when I left Pennsylvania. The camp was overcrowded and undersupplied. Thousands of American prisoners packed into barracks that were never meant to hold so many. The food was watery soup and stale bread, never enough to satisfy the constant gnawing hunger. Disease was rampant, dysentery, typhus, pneumonia. Men died every day, and there was nothing we could do except try to stay alive ourselves. But even there, even in that place of despair, we found ways to be human. We shared what little we had. We organized ourselves, looked out for each other, maintained some semblance of discipline and hope. And at night, in those freezing barracks, we slept packed together, just like we had since the first day we landed in Europe. I found George Patterson in the camp, or what was left of him. The march and the train had taken most of his strength, and the camp was taking the rest. His feet, damaged by frostbite back in November, had turned gangrenous. The German doctors wanted to amputate, but there was no anesthesia, no proper surgical equipment. George refused. He said he'd rather die whole than live in pieces. I stayed with him every night, slept beside him even as the smell of his rotting feet filled my nostrils. Talked to him about Ohio, about his wife Margaret, about his kids Bobby and Susan. He showed me their photographs so many times that I memorized their faces. The wife with the kind eyes, the boy with his father's nose, the girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. George died on February 3rd, 1945. He went quietly, in his sleep, his hand in mine. I like to think he was dreaming of home at the end, dreaming of Margaret and the kids, of summer days and green fields, of everything the war had taken from him. I wept for George Patterson, wept like I hadn't wept since I was a child. Other men saw me crying, and they didn't judge. They understood. Some of them cried too. In that camp, surrounded by death and despair, we had permission to feel, permission to grieve, permission to be human. The camp was liberated on April 2nd, 1945. I remember the date because someone scratched it into the wall of our barracks, and for years afterward, I dream about those numbers carved in wood. American forces, tanks and infantry, and men who looked like angels in their clean uniforms, rolled into Bad Orb and set us free. I weighed 93 pounds the day I walked out of that camp. My hair had fallen out in patches. My teeth were loose in my gums. I couldn't stand upright without help, but I was alive. Against all odds, against everything the war had thrown at me, I was alive. The hospital in Paris was the first time I'd slept in a real bed in almost 2 years. Clean sheets, a mattress, a pillow. It felt impossibly luxurious, almost obscene after everything we'd been through. The nurses were kind and gentle, and they didn't ask too many questions about what we'd seen and done. They just fed us and cleaned us and let us sleep. But here's the thing, I couldn't sleep alone. After all those months of bodies pressed against mine, of shared warmth and shared fear, the empty space around me felt wrong, dangerous. I'd wake up in the night, reaching for someone who wasn't there, my heart pounding, my body slick with sweat. I wasn't the only one. All of us who'd made it out of the camps had the same problem. The doctors didn't understand it at first, but eventually they figured out that we slept better when we were close to each other. They rearranged the beds, pushed them together, let us recreate the closeness we'd learned to depend on. It wasn't regulation. It probably wasn't proper, but it worked. I came home in June of 1945. The war in Europe was over, and they were sending the survivors back as fast as they could process us. I took a ship across the Atlantic, and this time I was on deck as much as possible, watching the ocean, feeling the wind on my face, remembering how different it had felt 2 years earlier when I'd been heading the other way. My mother met me at the train station in Millbrook. She'd aged a decade in the 2 years I'd been gone. Her hair was grey, her face was lined, and when she saw me, saw what I'd become, she broke down crying. Clara was there too, 18 now, no longer the little girl I'd left behind. They held me for what felt like hours, right there on the platform, while strangers walked past and pretended not to see. Adjusting to life back home was harder than anything I'd faced in the war. The quiet was deafening. The normalcy was disorienting. People wanted me to be the Jack Callahan who'd left, but that Jack Callahan was dead. He died somewhere between Omaha Beach and Stalag Nai, and the man who'd come home in his place didn't know how to be a normal person anymore. I couldn't sleep alone. For months after I came back, I'd wake up screaming from nightmares I couldn't remember, reaching for Tony or George or Billy or any of the men who'd kept me alive. My mother took to sleeping in my room sometimes, in a chair by the bed, and her presence helped, but it wasn't the same. Nothing was the same. I went back to work eventually, got a job at the steel mill in town, got married to a woman named Dorothy, who was patient enough to love a man who was broken in ways she couldn't see. Had 2 kids, a boy named George, after Sergeant Patterson, and a girl named Clara, after my sister. Built a life, a good life. But the war never left me. It lived in my bones, in my dreams, in the way I'd flinch at loud noises and the way I couldn't eat soup without thinking of the camp. Dorothy understood, as much as anyone who hadn't been there could understand. She learned not to wake me when I was having nightmares, learned to speak softly when she entered a room, learned to hold me on the nights when the memories got too heavy. She was a saint, that woman. I didn't deserve her, but she stayed anyway, through all of it. I went to reunions sometimes, in the years after the war, met up with other survivors from my unit, from the camp, from those terrible months in Europe. We'd drink too much and talk too loud and tell stories that probably shouldn't have been funny, but made us laugh until we cried. And sometimes, at the end of the night, we'd pile into a hotel room and sleep on the floor together, packed tight like we used to be, because that was the only way some of us could sleep at all. Billy Cooper came to a few of those reunions. He'd survived the war, made it all the way to Germany before a sniper's bullet took his leg just weeks before the surrender. He walked with a prosthetic now, and the limp was bad. But he was alive. He'd become a teacher back in Iowa, married a local girl, had 4 kids. He told me once that he still dreamed about that bakery cellar in St. Lo, about the smell of bread, about the night we talked about home. The years went by. The 29th Division Association held its 50th reunion in 1994, and there weren't many of us left by then. Old men, all of us, with white hair and stooped shoulders and memories that felt more real than the present. We gathered in a hotel ballroom and listened to speeches about sacrifice and honor and the greatest generation. And then, late at night, those of us who could still manage it went upstairs and lay on the floor of someone's room, bodies touching, sharing warmth, remembering. I outlived most of them. Outlived Tony and George and Billy. Outlived Dorothy, who passed in 2008. Outlived my mother and my sister and most of the people I'd known in my long life. I'm 101 years old now, and sometimes I wonder why I'm still here when so many better men are gone. But then I remember what George Patterson said to me once, in that frozen foxhole back in '44. He said, "The point isn't why we survive, Jack. The point is what we do with the survival we're given. I've tried to do something with it. Tried to be a good husband, a good father, a good citizen. Tried to tell the truth about what happened over there, even when the truth was ugly and hard to hear. Because the world needs to know, needs to understand, needs to remember. When people ask me about the war now, I still tell them about the battles, about D-Day and the Bulge and the camps, but what I really want them to understand is something else, something simpler, something that might not seem heroic, but was the most important thing I learned in those terrible years. In Europe, we slept packed together because there was nowhere else to go. And in that closeness, in that shared vulnerability, we found something precious. We found our humanity. We found connection. We found the strength to keep going when everything inside us wanted to give up, the body heat of another human being, the sound of breathing in the dark, the knowledge that you're not alone, that someone else is facing the same fear, the same cold, the same uncertainty. That's what kept us alive, not guns or tanks or strategy, people, each other. I think about that a lot these days. I think about how we've become so separate, so isolated, so afraid to need each other. I watch the news and I see people shouting at each other, dividing themselves into camps, treating their neighbors like enemies. And I want to tell them, all of them, about what I learned in the war. About what happens when you strip away all the differences and the divisions and the distrust. About what we're capable of when we remember that we're all just scared people trying to survive in a world that doesn't always make sense. In the camps, It didn't matter if you were from New York or Texas, if you were Catholic or Protestant, if you were rich or poor back home. All that mattered was that you were there, and you were alive, and you could help keep someone else alive for one more night. The man shivering next to you might have been your enemy in another context, might have believed things you hated, might have lived a life completely different from yours. But in that moment, none of it mattered. You held on to each other because that's what humans do. That's who we are. I learned that kindness doesn't cost anything. I learned that strength isn't about never needing help. It's about being willing to accept it when it's offered, and to offer it when you can. I learned that the human spirit is more resilient than we give it credit for, that we can survive things we never imagined possible, as long as we don't have to survive them alone. Dorothy used to tell me I talked about the war too much. She said I needed to let it go, to live in the present, to stop looking backward. And she was right, in a way. The war took too much from me already without me giving it my future too. But I could never fully let it go, because letting go felt like betraying the men who didn't make it. Tony Russo, who never got to eat Italian food in France. George Patterson, who never saw his kids grow up. Billy Cooper's leg, left behind somewhere in Germany. All the boys on Omaha Beach, their blood mixing with the sand and the sea. I carry them with me, all of them. They're the weight I bear, the debt I owe, the reason I keep telling these stories, even when my voice gives out and my memory falters. Because someone has to remember, someone has to say their names, someone has to make sure the world knows they existed, that they mattered, that their lives meant something. And so here I am, 101 years old, talking to a camera about things that happened 80 years ago, trying to make people understand, trying to pass on whatever wisdom I might have gathered in my long life, hoping that somewhere, someone is listening. If you are listening, if you've made it this far, I want you to do something for me. I want you to reach out to someone today, someone you've lost touch with, someone you've been meaning to call, someone who might be alone and scared and could use a reminder that they matter. You don't have to say anything profound. You don't have to fix their problems or solve their pain. Just let them know you're there. Let them know they're not alone. Because in the end, that's all any of us really need. Connection, presence, the simple, profound comfort of another human being saying, I see you, I'm here. You're not alone. In Europe, we slept packed together because there was nowhere else to go. But I think looking back, we also did it because there was nowhere else we wanted to be. In the midst of all that horror, we found something beautiful. We found each other. And if we could do that there, in the mud and the blood and the frozen hell of war, then surely, surely we can do it here, in our homes, in our communities, in this fractured, frightened world that needs healing so badly. That's my story. That's what I learned. That's what I hope you'll carry with you when this video ends and you go back to your life. Thank you for listening to an old soldier ramble. Thank you for caring about history, about memory, about the men and women who gave everything they had so that the rest of us could be free. And thank you for remembering. My name is James Callahan. Most folks call me Jack. I was born in 1923 in a little town called Millbrook, Pennsylvania. I went to war when I was 18 years old, and I've been carrying it with me ever since. But I don't regret it, not for a single moment. Because the war taught me what matters. It taught me who I am. It taught me that we're stronger together than we ever are apart. And that's a lesson I'll take to my grave. Stay warm out there. Stay close to the people who love you. And don't forget, no matter how dark the night gets, morning always comes. It always comes. God bless you all. And God bless the men who didn't make it home. This is Jack Callahan, signing off.